participants both in person as well as online. This is one of the few hybrid events I've been part of, so please bear with us. I think it'll be quite interesting, and we don't want to leave anyone out. So I'll be hopping in between our audience here as well as online. And just to introduce myself, I'm Zainab Sadan. I'm with WWF South Africa, the Worldwide Fund for Nature. And I get to work on plastic policy issues on the global stage, which is really, really interesting. And today we are here for issues around climate, but those are not two separate issues, right? Climate issues spans across various value chains, various environmental issues, as well as socioeconomic issues. And the same goes for youth. So that's why we're here today. We're here as part of a broader program called the Climate Ambition to Accountability Project. And those are quite strong words: climate, ambition, as well as accountability. And I won't be talking too much about that. I'll allow our next speakers to introduce more about the program, which is also co-funded by the European Union. And so today we have two sessions. The first will be our Youth Climate Champions launch. So that will be really exciting. You'll get to hear about the program, some of the activities, how you can get involved. And then the second part of our program will be an intergenerational dialogue. And the topic for that dialogue is really exciting, something that is really something that I feel very passionate about and something that I can relate to personally, which is beyond youth tokenism. And so think about that topic a little, think about how it shows up in your lives, and we'll discuss that a little bit more. Okay, so I have a few house rules before we begin, because this is a hybrid event, as I mentioned. So it will be recorded, and the exciting part about that is that it will show up as an episode on our podcast series that is also part of the Youth Climate Champions program. So that is really exciting. While you'll also have the opportunity to ask some questions during session 1 as well as session 2. And while the speakers are talking, I'll ask you to please mute your microphones online, and those who are in person, please put your phones on silent so we don't get disturbed and we don't get unnecessary interruptions or disturbances with sound. And then lastly, when you are taking the floor to ask a question, I would like you to introduce yourself as well as the organization you represent, if any. And we'll also like to keep it to one question. We have quite a few people here in the room live with us, but we also have quite a few people online. Right now, I'm seeing 116 participants. That is really amazing. So yes, a round of applause. And I'm so excited to hear some of your voices. Okay, so I think that is it. I'm going to introduce our very first speaker, and she is here with us in person in Braamfontein. It's Ariana Labat, and she is the EU delegate and former climate negotiator. So she has some experiences to share with us. And I hear that she'll be sharing some of the EU actions around youth issues, both in South Africa and beyond. So welcome, Ariana, over to you.
Thanks so much, Zainab. Molweni Nonke, both all of you online and you're all in the room today. I'm very happy to celebrate with you one day in advance the Youth Day. It's a very important celebration for us in the EU, and it shows our shared value to build a just and green recovery and a future that is more inclusive and more sustainable for all of you in the youth group. So I just want to share with you some examples of what we do as European Union, what we do back home, because we are one of the major emitters in the planet. So we have to start back home as well, and how we work with you on that climate action agenda. And then I will give you some more examples of what we are doing here as partners of South Africa in its journey to a climate resilient net zero future. But I'm also happy to take any of your questions. So first of all, what we do back home. So the European Green Deal is our growth strategy for the future. And everything is in the name. It's European, it's green, and it's a deal with our citizens, and notably with our young citizens, that we're going to grow in a different manner, with sustainable production, sustainable consumption, integrating very seriously the climate neutrality goal in absolutely every sector of our economy, in every sector of our society, and at all levels, from the European level to the national level, regional level, cities level, rural areas. Like, everyone has to be on board, because it's really a massive transition that we have to realize. And how the youth is associated to that change? Well, first of all, it's a political pressure. The youth are voting, the youth are in the streets, the youth are putting some topics on the agenda that then the European Parliament or the different ministers are taking in their debates. But we also have created a number of platforms for formal dialogue. So my political master, the Executive Vice President, Frans Timmermans, who is very high in the hierarchy in the European Union, is very regularly having extremely serious, in-depth dialogue with the climate youth champion, as well as with citizens all over Europe, to really engage on co-creating this new green growth that we are talking about. So very recently, it was in what we call the Climate Pact dialogue. So Climate Pact is a system whereby some citizens in the different European region propose some action to their communities, and they build, if you like, bottom-up complementary and responding action to what we try to build with regulation, with carbon markets, etc., etc. But the two really nourish each other. So that's really one example. Then turning a little bit to what we do here in South Africa. Likewise with the ambassadors here in Pretoria from the European Union, but also from the 22 member states who are based in Pretoria, they have chosen this theme of just and green recovery really as a way to join forces with South African partners and amongst us to make really a big impact. And what this means is that in across all the different aspects of our relation, it can be our trade and investment discussion, in our scientific cooperation discussion, in our policy discussion on environmental issues, we really go deep into that space of okay, how can we recover from the pandemic in a slightly different way, in a way that is a bit more inclusive, a bit more sustainable? How do we build that in a way that is responsive to South Africa unemployment, poverty, inequality challenges? So that's the theme that's going to stay with us for a number of years. And it translates in practice into some major political initiative. That's why the EU at the head of state level has joined South Africa head of state for the Just Energy Transition Partnership. But it also translates into very concrete projects, investment activities. We have been supporting, for instance, the Presidential Climate Commission consultation in the various communities around the country, in the rural areas, in eMahleni, in Carolina. So really that there are voices from the ground that go into the South Africa Just Transition Framework and into defining your priorities for just transition. We are also active with a number of youth climate champions in trying to raise awareness, because very clearly, you know, in Europe, we were able to push the envelope to pass some legislation that are difficult to implement, that are genuinely difficult, because we had the support, very broad support in society. And in South Africa, maybe there's still some way to go so that everyone has kind of ownership of these challenges. So we have regularly around the month of September what we call the Team Europe Climate Diplomacy Weeks, which are public events. We give space for champions like Agona, like people from the business world, people from local authorities, our member states champion, on how they do it in practice, you know, how they are managing in their communities, I don't know, to plant fruit trees, because this solves multiple issues at the same time, food security issues, but also nature-based solution to adapt better to climate change. So we are very keen to do it. And September this year, we definitely want to do it again with a lot of youth participants. And lastly, I want to say that the investment in South Africa climate youth started before. We had this green angle. My colleagues from Cooperation, they did wonderful projects, for instance, renovating fully and building new student housing in Fort Hare University. So, you know, in partnership with National Treasury, with all South African institutions, we really want to be there. It's a very important segment of South Africa society that we want to invest in. And zooming back to today's events, the WWF initiative is one of our 5 climate champion grants. You have also further grants, for instance, in between Green Cape, Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, Western Cape, investing into climate champion at the local level, at the level of the schools. We have further initiatives in more rural areas. So we hope very much to be part of this journey. The good thing of the climate champion grants is that they are over several years. So we have time to think, to discuss, to pilot approaches, and really to work with you and work this journey together. You know, you must always remember in Europe, we have 30 regions that are really equivalent to Mpumalanga, extremely coal dependent, with massive unemployment, youth unemployment challenge. We are walking the same journey. You have your challenges as South Africans, we have ours, but we can learn from each other. So it's really from that spirit that I'm here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariana. I think you brought up some interesting issues and interesting topics as well that might be discussed in our dialogue later today. And yes, thank you so much for the role that you're playing in contributing to these type of dialogues, the pilot projects that you mentioned, and doing this journey together, because the climate issue is quite broad in terms of how to start tackling. The youth issues is also quite broad. And so it's really interesting to have these types of partnerships, as well as the organizations that involved here today, which brings us to our next speaker. The next speaker is Pato Kelisitse, and she is actually calling in from Gaborone, Botswana. And she will be with us online. She's the project coordinator of the South African Climate Action Network, as well as the Youth Climate Champions convener. And she's been part of the climate space for the last 7 years now. So I will hand over to you, Pato, to tell us more about the Youth Climate Champions project. Thank you.
Hi, Zainab. Hi, Ariana. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm joining online, and I'm able to see that there's like 150 people joining, which is really, really exciting. Thank you for joining us all. Before I start my presentation, actually, I have a question for you, because like we said, this is, well, we haven't said this yet, but we're looking to do this to support the work of youth on the ground. Let me try share my screen. There we go. So the first question I would like, or first input I'd like from you is, in one word, what is the role of youth in addressing climate change? We're often told what our role should be, where we should fit in, but according to you, people in the room, what is our role in your words? So I think you're allowed to submit 3 words. So if you can just throw that in there, quickly. Thank you for sharing the link. So you follow that link and then you put in the code 77154846. Shengi, should I hand over to you and you share the screen of the responses so far? Shengi, where are we winning with the responses? Okay, I guess we'll have to see the responses. Okay, the code again is The code again is 77154846. I will share it in the chat. Hlengi, please share the response. Please share your screen with the response of the words that we've gotten so far on what our role should be. Hlengi, are we winning? Somke, I see your question and it's going to be answered just now in my presentation, which is going to start in 2 seconds. As soon as we see the responses there. Okay, there's a bit of a delay. Oh, there we go.
Here we go.
What one word would you use to describe the role of youth in addressing climate change? So presence, definitely presence. We should be there. To motivate, yes, the work that is currently being done by youth is very motivating. Not enough, that's fair. Currently, there is a lot of space for growth in terms of youth involvement. Trainer of the trainee, educate, hopeful, hope, seeing a lot of hope there. Leaders, active leaders. So far, those are our two words which have been shared the most. Action. So I'm going to do the top 4 and then we're going to continue with the presentation. I see leaders, awareness, active, and action. Thank you so much. Please continue to throw those words in, and then at the end of the my presentation, we'll take another look so we see if we're on the right path with this. While you're submitting, maybe also just take a look and keep these in mind and see if we're keeping true to them. Thank you so much for sharing screen, Hlengi. Motivate from Siyabonga. We've got that. Thanks. Thank you. So I will now share my screen and let's see. Zainab, please just confirm that you can see my screen. Awesome. So we can't talk about the Youth Climate Champions program without talking about our parent quote-unquote project. So the Youth Climate Champions program is an initiative under the 4-year Climate Ambition to Accountability project, which is a partnership between WWF South Africa, South African Climate Action Network, where I'm a project officer, and the Institute for Economic Justice. And the project is co-funded by the European Union. And the objective of this project is to strengthen civil society for proactive engagement in relevant policy processes and to mainstream issues in national climate policy. For a little bit of background on that, South Africa, as we know, is rather poorly, although it is improving, prepared for a transition away from its heavy dependence on fossil fuels. There are key challenges that are here hindering the pursuit of more ambitious climate action. And there's a lot of fragmentation among actors and inadequately capacitated civil society organizations and youth groups, weak policy ambition, implementation and accountability is lacking, and there's a limited attention to human rights, equity, and gender dimensions of climate change. And with the Climate Ambition to Accountability project, it's designed to address these challenges by working closely with environmental and social CSOs to build a strong cross-cutting community, including a cohort of youth climate champions, which is why we are here today. So why the YCC program on top of the Climate Ambition to Accountability project? We've realized, like Zainab highlighted, we've realized that the youth play a very unique role, and youth in South Africa operates at the margins of the climate policy process. So even when there's advancements in South Africa, it does not necessarily mean the youth are brought with. The youth engagement has been largely fragmented. There's a lack of access to climate policy processes. Thus, there's a lack, which also limits input into the climate policy that is created. And then there's also limited access to resource, knowledge, and expertise and opportunities, which are the challenges that we are looking to address. Now to come to it, what is the YCC program that we are launching today? The YCC program is a platform that seeks to capacitate, support, and facilitate collaboration among youth and youth organizations in South Africa addressing climate change. Through sector-wide activities guided by youth, the YCC program shall enable partnerships among youth and youth organizations for the common cause of climate action. The outcome of this program shall be youth who are better positioned to influence and make material contributions towards South Africa's climate policy and processes. So we identify as a platform because we do understand that the work has been happening, the work continues to happen, and in respecting the work that's already been done by youth on the ground, we are saying we would like to amplify that, would like to support that, would like to, where we can, contribute in a way that amplifies the impact of the work that's already being done. Our target group for this program is youth interested in climate change. So you don't necessarily have to have an academic background or job experience or any sort of experience in the field, really, as long as you're interested. If you see climate change and you're curious, you are moved to act, you are interested, this program is catering for you. And then age range, we're looking at 18 to 35, as we know that's the youth age range according to Africa Union, which South Africa is a part of. But we will have a preference for the age range 18 to 30. Because this is a 4-year program, we're looking at starting with people and finishing the program with them, even as other people will be joining. And the program is national, and we encourage youth in remote areas to connect with us, and in trying to be as accommodating as we can of people participating. That's why we've got the data support, transport support. We understand that engaging youth is it's not the same as engaging other people, and we try to make it as accommodating as possible. If there's a way we can make it even more accommodating for you, please do reach out. And then the YCC has a steering committee. The steering committee is made up of 9 steering committee members of South African youth with experience in climate action and youth mobilizing. So these 9 youth are people who either primarily work with climate action or primarily mobilize youth. We understand that climate goes beyond just people who work in the area. That's us opening it up to people who are also in youth mobilizing. And their role will be to guide and advise on our proposed activities, which we'll get into in a little bit, ensure that we don't duplicate existing efforts, ensure relevance of our work to South African youth. Like we said, the platform is to serve South African youth, and ensure we are adding value to the South African youth climate action movement. So a big part of it is to add value. The reason we've got a steering committee is because even though the secretariat from the CAAP project, most of us on the project, on the YCC team are youth, we understand that we don't always know what's going on everywhere. So we tried to bring on more people so we have more knowledge on the team and better guidance. I'm going to be a little bit quick because I can see we're falling a little behind time, to also have time for a Q&A. I see hands are being raised. May I please encourage you to type your questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll respond from there, once again because of the time limit. So if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box and we'll get to it just now. So our proposed activities are, well, to establish the program and its launch, to establish the YCC steering committee, which has been done, and then the Youth Climate Champions podcast series. So I'm just touching on these, and a lot of them you'll hear more about with time. So with the podcast series, we're going to have a few conversations by youth on climate action. If you are interested in hosting an episode, please do reach out to us. We'll share our details at the end of the presentation. So if you'd like to lead a conversation, if there's a particular topic that you'd like to lead on, or your organization would like to lead on, we will cover all the logistics. You just have to bring the conversation. We're also going to have a social media activist training that's going to be coming up in a bit. And then we've got our annual Youth Climate Bootcamp. We're also going to employ 6 youth champion internships who will be placed within the 3 partner organizations. So that's WWF, IEJ, and SACAN. So over 2 years, there'll be 6 youth interns. 3 are already in office, and we're going to have another 3 in the next year. So if you keep an eye on our social media pages, that is where we will be advertising them, and then people can apply. And then lastly, we're looking to develop training modules on climate policy, politics, and participation. Like we said earlier, we have identified a big gap in capacity to engage on these, and we're hoping that this allows, helps youth engage on all of these. And I would now like to invite you to get involved. So like we said, this is for you. The more involved you are, the more you are able to ensure that what happens in this program is tailored for you and meets what you need. So please sign up for the newsletter. Some of these links Lenny will share in the chat just now. Please sign up for the newsletter. We share everything that will be coming out. It's a quarterly newsletter. We also take submissions. If there's any work that you're doing and you would like to share it with us, you'd like us to share it on the newsletter, please pop it in there. And then make sure you register with our Youth and Climate Change database. This helps us as different projects come up. We know who to reach out to, who to engage, what you are doing, and the like. So please make sure you sign up to that. That will also be shared in the chat. And then to help us better design our youth bootcamp, we've got a questionnaire that's also being shared in the chat. So I'm asking you for quite a lot, but all of this will follow up after the launch. We'll share all these links with you. And the questionnaire is around what would you like to see at the bootcamp? How can we make it more relevant for you? If we're going to have a bootcamp, we want to make sure that we're making the best use of your time. And then you can also reach out about hosting a podcast episode. Like I said, you just need a topic. We'll mobilize all the logistics. And then follow us on social media. Everything we do is shared on social media. And lastly, stick around until the end of the launch, because we've got a very big announcement at the end on how you can get involved. And I think you're going to want to stick around to hear that. And with that, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much for engaging. I'm so excited to see all of you here. Zainab, back to you. I think we're going to go into the question and answers now.
Yes, we are. Thanks so much, Pato. And those are really exciting opportunities for us here to get involved in. I know it's a lot, so I'm sure the presentation as well as all the follow-up actions will be made available to you afterwards. And please come chat to us, whether you're here in person or online. We'll leave our contact details there. But for now, we do have some time for questions for both Ariana on her presentation earlier, as well as Pato on the Youth Climate Champions program as well. It can be any sort of question on what they raised today. So I think we might take one from the online participants. I think it will pop up on my screen shortly. If you do have any other questions, please do pop it in the Q&A, and then we'll also take one in person. Okay, so one from Dimple Hoffman. I think, Pato, this goes to you. How do I join the organization? So Pato, maybe you can elaborate on which organizations are involved and maybe how they can join the activities.
Yes. So we, sorry, I just came on spotlighted. So we are not an organization. We're a partnership, like I said, of 3 organizations. So there's IEJ, SACAN, and WWF. And if you'd like to be part of the activities under the YCC program, you can just join our youth database. It was shared just now. Yeah. So if you look in the chat, you can share the database, and when we have activities, we'll reach out to you. When we have opportunities, there'll also be a funding mechanism. We'll share it there. So we're not taking membership, but you can reach out to us about what your organization is doing and how we can support you. I hope that answers you. And then there was a question on age. Age, we're looking at 18 to 35. And then I'm going to hand over to Zainab because she's taking the questions.
Thanks, Pato. We do have one in person. So was it for Michelle? Go ahead, Michelle.
Cool. So my question is, how accessible are the funding opportunities to organizations led particularly by youth, and maybe a little bit into the criteria, and what sort of projects are funded by the European Union?
Great. So that's a question for Ariana. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes. So, okay. The European Union projects with South Africa, the collaboration project, the bulk of it are actually budget transfer to South Africa budget, because that's the way you have the greatest impact. You use national structures, and the national treasury is using this money in a ring fencing manner. So if we give money for, as I was saying, for student accommodation, it's not going to go for a completely different project. National Treasury manages it through its national structure, because that's the way you can also have questions in parliament, or using all the normal democratic structure. For the support to civil society organization, we do competitive procedure. So that's how the WWF and the consortium was successful. We put a call for proposal, and it's a competition. It's the race. It's the best way we have some transparency. And then at the level of, if you like, one level more specific, we have a number of programs for youth that are based on your direct application. We have, for instance, a program we call Erasmus Mundus. It's basically if you want to go and study for a semester in Europe. And this has to be within your universities. You have to apply, you have to identify your university you want to go to in Europe. And then you can build with your university a system to access to European programs. Likewise for research projects. South Africa is exceptionally successful at joining research and innovation program from Europe. And that is about universities. It's also the excellence of your research system. So, and really this green area of innovation is massive. And we are investing massive amounts. One way we are so attached to our carbon pricing mechanism, it's because it creates revenue, for instance, to finance next generation of innovation. So we really welcome further young South African researcher in that endeavor. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ariana, for that, for the answers to that really important question on funding. We do have one more question online. So Pato, I think this one's addressed to you around when the program will kick in. And then there was also a question around on-site or virtual participation in the various activities.
Thanks, Zainab. May I please add something to what Ariana just said on funding before I answer those two? Okay. With the funding, so through the YCC program and some of the activities that we'll be doing, we're looking at capacitating youth to make sure that they're also able to apply for some of these bigger funding. So it's quite a bit of work to apply for some of the EU programs, but it is worth it. So we're looking to capacitate youth so that they're able to apply for some of this funding, know where to even begin. And then secondly, within the CAAP project, we've got a small, well, this is yet to be launched, but we've got a finance mechanism which will be looking at almost sub-funding the smaller projects. And that will be shared with you on our newsletter. Make sure you sign up for the newsletter once again. And the questions that you did ask me, when will the program kick in? The program has kicked in. We're launching today, so the program has kicked in. You are part of the program kicking in. And then there was a question on virtual or physical participation. Yes, you can join us physically or virtually, like we're doing today. Like we said, we're trying to make sure that everyone is involved. So just because you can't travel to Joburg, you shouldn't be left out of the YCC program. So everything that's available physically will ensure to make sure that it's also available virtually. I hope that answers the two questions.
Thank you so much, Pato. And this is actually getting me really excited for some of those activities that are coming up, and also to see how many of you will be involved in that as we take it forward. So thank you so much for being part of our launch. That brings us to the end of the first session. And to those questions that we didn't have time to answer, we might take it up a little later in our session today, or we might answer it via the newsletter or via the other channels of communications, such as our social media as well. So please do keep the questions coming in. Oh, Pato, you had something to add?
Is it okay if I just respond to some of them via chat?
Yes, you may. So if you do have more questions, please pop it in the Q&A. Pato and other members of the team will also be monitoring that. So please do answer that. And thank you so much to Ariana for your presentation earlier, as well as your contribution to some of the questions that were asked today. We are going to transition into session 2. This is our intergenerational dialogue, and the topic or the theme will be around beyond youth tokenism. So I'm going to invite our 3 panelists who are with us here in person today to come up on stage with me, and also invite Kulekane, who's our online panelist, who will be joining us virtually. So please join me up here on stage. And before we start the dialogue today, I'd just like us to arrive. And what I mean by that is really to come as our full package of human beings that we are, right? So I like to think of human beings as the physical, the mental or intellectual, as well as the emotional and spiritual. And so we're going to try to arrive here together today. And now I'm not just referring to our panelists who are going to be engaging with us live. I'm also talking about the participants. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick activity for us to help guide us through this. So you are welcome to keep your eyes open, so lowering your gaze, and the focus here is just to turn inward. If you are comfortable, you can close your eyes as well, and we're just going to check in with our bodies. So how are you feeling today? If you are here with us in person, it might be a bit weird. This might be one of the first few interactions you had in a long time due to the pandemic. It might be a bit intimidating to be among some of the people here today. It might be exciting to feel what are those things that you're feeling in your physical being today. Have a quick body scan through your body from the toes all the way up through to the fingers, all the way up through to the head. And when we arrive in the head, this is where all our thoughts and mental activity is going on. And I'm going to prompt you again around the theme for us today. It's beyond youth tokenism. How do you identify when it comes to that theme? Do you identify as youth, first and foremost? And what feelings or thoughts or emotions come up for you when you think about youth? Whether you are experiencing that feeling right now as a youth in the age bracket that we suggested, or your memories of youth, whatever that is. And then finally, just arriving into your emotions around the topic. It might be bringing up memories or experiences that are charged with emotion, whether that's anger, whether that's frustration, whether that's hope or optimism. Tune into those emotions, and I'm sure there's not just one, I'm sure it's a mixed bag. and acknowledge that. Acknowledge that we are all bringing our own experiences, and we're welcoming the experiences, the perspectives, and the diverse views from everyone in this room and within ourselves, because sometimes the conflict lies there as well. And when you're ready, take a deep belly breath, breathing into the belly on an inhale and exhale, and you can gently open your eyes when you are ready. And coming back to the room, coming back to everyone around us. So I'm going to welcome our panelists now. And to be honest, I'm a little intimidated by being surrounded by them. And what's quite amazing about today's discussion is that it is intergenerational. That means we are acknowledging our diverse age, the different generations that we grew up in, the different experiences that we have, and that we all bring or offer something to this conversation, something to this theme, this topic. And so it gives me really, really great pleasure to kind of go through some of these speaker bios. So I'm going to start on my left with Bulalwa. Bulalwa is the Executive Director of the Open Society Foundation of South Africa. She has extensive expertise in community engagement, as well as furthering the aims of social justice and human rights. Her experiences also include some leadership positions in organizations such as the Bertha Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship and the Philippi Strategy Project. Now, Bulalwa's academic training is actually in town and regional planning from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So she brings quite a mixed bag of experiences and perspectives here today. So I'm really excited to have you on board. I'm going to go over to my far right, which is Crispian Alva. And Crispian is the Executive Director of the Presidential Climate Commission, responsible for running the Secretariat of the Commission and its various policy and research programs. He's also served in various capacities in the South African government, in various departments as well. I'll name a few: the Department of Environmental Affairs and Tourism, which its previous name in the time that he served. And also he's an author of a couple of books as well, I hear. So if you do have a copy of one of his books, such as A House Divided or How to Steal a City, these titles already just capture me. And then finally, he's actually completing his PhD at WITS in the politics department. So bringing also quite a diverse kind of range of experiences. But his academic training didn't start there. It was actually in medicine. So yeah, quite an interesting character. I'm going to move on to Michelle, who is a Zimbabwean-born, Cape Town-based computer science and applied mathematics student. She's a public speaker and an activist, spreading the word about the climate crisis and the related social issues among the youth. She's also the program coordinator for the African Climate.
Yasira, we've lost you. Yasira? Yes, I mean, Zainab.
Likani is a young theologian and climate justice activist. So he brings the faith-based perspectives to the climate space. He is the executive director of the South African Youth Climate Change Coalition, the national coordinator of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance based in South Africa, and also a council member of the Lutheran World Federation. Kulikani is actually also interested in Pan-Africanism, liberation, human rights, and humanitarian laws. So please help me welcome our four panelists. And we are actually going to start off with another Mentimeter question, I believe. So I think it'll pop on screen very shortly. And again, we're going to ask you for that one word that comes to mind when you hear youth tokenism. It can be a feeling, it can be a memory, an experience, but what is that one word? When you hear the topic of youth tokenism, what is that? And actually, I'm going to ask our panelists to give that one word while we wait for our audience to contribute to the Mentimeter poll. So I'll start with Kulelwa. What is the one word that pops into your mind?
When I hear about tokenism or just youth tokenism,
Youth tokenism.
is not being able to give
A token. You
a
only
set
have a
of
token of
data
something.
and has an influence in the decisions that we make and the actions that we take as a society when in relation to climate. And therefore they're there, but they're not, their voices are not heard.
There, but our voices are not heard. Thank you for that contribution. Michelle, I'm going to move over to you.
Dishonesty.
Okay, short and sweet, dishonesty, but very powerful as well. Crispian.
Pervasive. It's everywhere. Everyone talks about the youth. Very few people practice it.
Kulikani, over to you. That one word.
I'd say lack of trust.
Lack of trust. And we're actually seeing some of our audience responses on the screen now as well. Taken advantage of. Again, dishonesty, silenced, empty, overlooked, recognized, a myth. Can we pop it back on screen again? A lie, unintentional, show but no action. So these are quite strong and powerful words that really sets the tone of our discussion today. And I think a lot of the words that already popped up, the biggest actually now and front and center is exploitation. And this really leaves us with that negativity, the heaviness, the feeling that we're not doing enough. And today's dialogue is really to move beyond that. So how we can reflect on our own individual experiences, our own perspectives, and how we can move forward. So the conversation today will also take the form of moving from what it actually is. So what? Why does it actually matter? Why is it important? And what now? What shall we do to move beyond it? So I'm going to open the floor now for our panelists to really answer this question. What is causing it? And what is your current understanding of youth tokenism based on your individual experiences? And I really encourage you to tap into that with some examples from your own personal and professional experiences in youth tokenism, whether you've been a part of it, whether you've been party to it, and what you're starting to observe. So I'll start over with Crispian.
Okay. So, yeah, I run this organization called the Climate Commission. And the way the commission was set up, we've got all these different stakeholders, organized business, big trade unions, government ministers, civil society, and we've got youth. We've got a couple of young people represented on the commission. And as the commission, we're committed to involving youth substantively in our programs. I have to say, so we're only a little bit over a year in office, but reflecting on the commission, I still feel we're not getting the kind of substantive youth engagement that we want. It may be a bit harsh to say that it's tokenistic, but I'm standing up and saying I'm part of the crowd that's to blame. We're not getting the youth participation that we want. Part of the reason I signed up for this panel was I was hoping to find ways that I could deepen that participation. I mean, I've got some reflections on why, but I don't know if you want me to go into those.
Maybe you can leave it there.
Can I leave it there?
Yeah, you can park it there, and we'll move on to Michelle. What is your current understanding and some of the experiences that you have that you'd like to share?
I think firstly, just because of the nature of the space, when you look at the environmental space in South Africa, a lot of the times you're finding that youth are being involved in projects and programs simply because they are youth, and not necessarily because those who are driving those projects might think that they have something like worthy to contribute. I think it might be a great time now to actually mention that I am part of the Secretariat with the Climate Ambition to Accountability Project. They're representing one civil society organization as well in my capacity as a youth. But I mean, when you really look at youth tokenism, or what I have experienced with it, is the first time I realized that I may be used as a token was a couple of years ago, when I just got into the environmental space and I started making a little bit more noise. And then you'd find that on the days leading up to June 16, year after year, including this year, media houses and other people, other projects, other organizations are now on the hunt for youth to speak on this panel, on that panel, not this panel though. And I always ask, and especially in those panels, where is this energy, for the rest of the year? Why are we only doing this the week leading up to June 16? Are we only important the week leading up to June 16? In which case, a lot of the times it's not actually about the current youth. It's more about the youth of 1976. Because again, the questions are always, what do you think about the youth of 1970? I'm like, I've been sharing my thoughts for the past 3 years. I think maybe let's start talking about now. So I think that's my immediate thought when it comes to youth tokenization and really just being involved in a lot of different things. I always, because of the nature of the space, I always have to go, am I being tokenized? Or is this a genuine sort of partnership or an opportunity? And it was very difficult for me to be able to sort of discern that from the get-go. Each opportunity looks like a great opportunity, trust me. And then you realize they ghost you and you're like, I was used. But yeah, I guess in conclusion, it's really not putting your money where your mouth is and saying we want youth representation. A lot of the times it's about opportunities. A very good example would be, maybe there's a funding opportunity that's coming through and you need to have X representatives who are youth. And then as an organization, naturally, you would look for youth. And as soon as the funding comes through, you're like, actually, thanks, but goodbye. That's a very great example of youth tokenization. And that's been my experience thus far.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that and for sharing some of the personal experience that comes up. And I think a lot of us can actually relate, me personally being one of them. And I think it's a very human, natural response to not want to be used and not to just want to be a symbolic gesture of something that seems good, right? And so it definitely puts up those walls and those barriers and that feeling of being suspicious of everyone and every opportunity that comes your way. And so I think we also need to just realize that that's just a very human feeling and nobody wants to be in that space. So I also just want to continue with the sharing from a youth perspective with Khulekani, and perhaps you can also add to some of the experiences that you've had and also your understanding of youth tokenism currently in your personal and professional life. And perhaps we can see your video now as well. Khulekani? Okay, perhaps Kulikani will join us a little later. Bulawa, over to you. I'd like to maybe reflect on what has been already mentioned by Crispian and Michelle, and your own experience of this issue and how it shows up in your world.
It's funny. I mean, what made me get on a flight to come to Joburg the day before Youth Day was because when this invitation landed in my inbox, my first reaction was, really, tokenism? Because I'm of the opinion that youth don't wait to be invited, they take the power themselves. And then I had to think a little bit more about why am I reacting in this way? And I realized that there's a number of reasons. First, we've seen youth. I mean, as I've said, you know, our democracy would not have been born without that sort of giving that came from young people. I remember I was in London during the climate strikes, and I saw young people all over, you know, protesting climate. And I know in South Africa, 5,000 of those young people went to Sasol and they protested climate. And know in the PCC, I was sitting next to a very young, very articulate young woman at the PCC who articulated the issues that are facing climate as it relates to youth, and not asking for permission and basically telling us what needs to be done and making us understand. And I also, in fact, in terms of my own children, would tell me every day that we've messed up the climate and there is no plan B. And so what are we going to do about it? And maybe set aside because it's time for them to do something. So I got a bit excited and a bit reflective about the topic, because I think that what makes it being tokenistic, almost like Women's Day. I mean, what you said about Youth Day can be, that's why I was laughing, because it's exactly the same for Women's Day. It requires a sustained energy continuously throughout the 365 days of the year, where young people are able to know, to be supported, first of all, in terms of resources, know which doors to knock and how those doors can open for them to have opportunity, but also to not be overwhelmed by day-to-day living, which overwhelms everybody, especially with our unemployment rate being what it is within the country and COVID, etc. And so you end up being, so the other question I would put, maybe I'm moving a little bit too fast, but is it an unintentional tokenism that is a result of the consequences, or is it an intentional tokenism, which means you bring them to the table because you want them to be there, but you don't want them to say a lot because they are, in fact, they need to be seen, not heard. If you go back to what they used to say about children, So my question is, I would end my session, my input by saying that I'm not taking the word tokenism as a given. I'm taking it as it applies to youth and climate, as something that happens sometimes unintentionally, and maybe in my own generation, that's something that we've done in terms of philanthropy. Possible that's something that we are also guilty of. But at the same time, we fail to realize that young people it's almost like herding cats, right? They don't want none to be harnessed into a 9-to-5 type of job. They want to have the freedom to be able to push and pull and push back sometimes. And maybe it's that sort of kind of energy meets a complete brick wall when it comes to the generational issues, where you actually have your performance issues and you need to be following where the money is going, how the money is used, etc., etc., etc. And so there might be some issues there that we might have to actually at least look at as stumbling blocks in preventing tokenism, or what seems like tokenism. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying sometimes it's unintentional.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think you brought some interesting discussion points. Firstly, around the fact that it needs to be a sustained energy. Like, why are we only making it around Youth Day? And maybe it's case in point with this panel today. But how do we create that sustained energy. And perhaps the Youth Climate Champions project is a part of that. So launching now, but then sustaining that energy going forward. And then the other theme that you brought up is this intentionality. Like, are we being intentional about it? If we are unintentionally creating youth tokenism, it's still not okay. And what we can do about it. So like you rightfully said, what are the stumbling blocks and what are we actually going to do in practice? So I'm going to ask Kulikani now if he is with us online, maybe to provide some of his insights. Kulikani, are you with us?
I believe I am fully with you. If this network is not betraying me again. I'm very sorry I've been disappearing. The network in this community that I'm at is not really friendly to me. Greetings to everybody. Thanks, Zainab, for this opportunity. Before I tell you what I think about youth tokenism, I just want to tell you what I am thinking after Bulelwa talked about the unintended tokenism. Last year, at this time last year, when we were preparing for COP, we talked about, many civil society organizations talked about the technical injustice, which was obviously, trying to push back against this proposal to make the COP and the whole conference online because of the inequities that were there. But when we talked about the technical injustice, we went beyond to even saying that it is happening in some of the climate spaces, especially the policy processes, where you invite somebody who is not technically aware of what is happening, right? So I will give you an example. I am an activist, and obviously my activism is based on climate justice. So anybody who can invite me to talk about the fourth industrialization, to talk about the robotic era, and then invite me into talking about communication, the modern communications, the online space, 5G, and so on and so on. I would not be participating effectively in those in those processes because I know almost nothing. So this is what also happens in our climate policy processes. Most of the times we invite young people that we know they are only conscious about what is happening, but then the issues that we want to discuss with them are too technical that when we get to that space, they will only listen and be and not confident enough to speak. And so that is, I think, sometimes it could be unintentional, but sometimes it could be because of ignorance or just not thinking about that issue seriously. Some time ago, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, 2 years back, I was in a conference where I was also a speaker. Not really a speaker, but I was making an intervention, and the person who was facilitating that whole discussion responded to me and to the audience and said, "I appreciate the young person who has spoken. We really need young people to speak." And right at that time, I had to raise my hand again and remind the person that I am that he must not only recognize the voice, but he should also listen to the message that I have delivered. And why am I sharing that story? I think most of the times when young people are invited into spaces, this is what we only see. We only recognize the voices, but we are ignoring the messages that are being delivered by young people. We're ignoring the perspectives that young people are bringing into the spaces. We're only appreciating their participation. Even when we take it out to the street and doing the demonstrations and doing the marches, we only say, well, there is much more momentum growing among young people. We're appreciating that, but we fail to take their message, to take their demands into serious consideration. And because of that, I think this is why we're here today talking about youth tokenism. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Khulekani, thank you so much for those perspectives and also for sharing your experiences in the policy spaces that you're in. I think that's very valuable. And this issue that you bring up around how we can actually ensure youth is contributing to concrete actions, not just being the front face of the issue that you're speaking about, and actually going behind the scenes sometimes and being adequately prepared and have the capacity in order to sufficiently contribute to the conversation or to the actual intervention that's needed. And I'm going to welcome Crispian now to maybe share some of those perspectives you alluded to earlier, and also to respond to some of the insights that were shared now.
Yeah. No, thank you. And look, I'm going to be a little bit provocative. I'm more than happy for people to argue me down, because I may be wrong. I mean, my basic argument is that I think this is a two-way street. So there's some things that we as, this decrepit older generation that's failed have to do. Amongst other things, the policies that we talk about have to have substantive elements that address youth, and the processes that we follow have to allow for real proper participation. So, I completely accept that as the starting point. But having been in a number of engagements with young people and leaving those engagements dissatisfied because I felt that we didn't get to the real issues, I do want to throw the ball back and say, I think there's also some obligations on young people about how they engage. So the first point I want to make is about repertoires. The repertoire everyone seems to follow religiously is the Greta Thunberg repertoire. Shouting down the older generation, telling them that they're climate criminals and that they failed. Now, oppositional, I'm no stranger to oppositional politics. When I was a young person back in the 80s, I happily engaged in, provocative oppositional politics, and I think it's important and it has a place. But I do think there's got to be a diversity of repertoires. So oppositional politics is important, and at some times you've got to break down the door. I'm not disputing that. And I think young people breaking down the door at crucial moments is good. But there's also got to be other repertoires that you bring into the conversation in a way that once you've broken the door down, you get into the substance. And getting into the substance is what I feel is missing. The door gets broken down and then the next bit doesn't happen. And that's where I feel, maybe there's another part that I want to say. So there's the repertoires that are deployed. I know Michelle seems to be winding herself up now. There's the repertoires that are deployed, and then there's also the processes that are followed. So my other criticism of these youth processes is that they're often mobilized in isolation of other decision-making processes that are happening. And again, there's a time and place for that. I think at some point, you've got to campaign, set your sights. This is about breaking the door down. But there are times when you've got to say, look, there are these existing decision-making processes in society, whether it's in government or in business or in other kinds of organizations. And we want to structure our process so that we drop into those processes at critical moments and influence them and shape them and take them forward. So I'm throwing this criticism back. I mean, I'm accepting criticism, but I'm throwing this criticism back and I'm saying, both on the repertoires and on the design of the organizational processes you follow, I think you also need to step up to the mark a bit.
And I think I won't let Michelle wait any longer to react. Please go ahead, Michelle. And Kulikani, I hear you too.
Okay, so I'm also accepting criticism, but I do want to open up and say we are not all Gretas, right?
Yeah.
I think mine and Kulikani's acceptance to be here, that in itself is I think that little bit of diversity that you might be talking about. Second, I think I wanted to pose a question to the older generation to say, do you trust us? And maybe you can let that marinate for a little bit, because one of the things that we're really struggling with is to be trusted, right? So that means that currently those in power and those who are older than us are not really setting up systems that allow us to thrive. So that's why maybe you would find that the Gretas are coming up and the argument then about the repertoire then holds. But I do think that that is just one person who's being represented on Western media, right? Mm-hmm. When you come back on the ground, when you come back to a South African context, it starts to look a little bit different because youth are taking back power, particularly in their communities. You start looking at the fact that it's not everybody who has access to be on Zoom today, but that does not mean that they're not getting involved, particularly with climate issues. One of the things that I always talk about is the fact that when you say climate change to a community that has never heard about climate change before, it becomes very difficult to engage. But if you start speaking about environmental issues as they are, why are we living in such, an environment? How you start bringing the conversation to things that can be observed, things that can be felt. I just landed from Cape Town and we've had rain for the past 3 days, and particular areas have been flooding, right? You start the conversation around that. Why do you think this is the problem, and how can we solve it? And then you introduce the issue of climate change, right? So one thing that I've always tried to do in my work is not look at climate change as the word, because that means you're not speaking to a lot of people. Again, particularly in an African and specifically a South African context, it becomes very different. Why? Because the access to education is very different. The access to exposure is very different. The access to digital devices is very different. So you find that in itself is disadvantaging youth. I am very privileged to have been able to even be here as a youth constituent, right? So that was the first thing that I wanted to sort of ask, like, do you actually trust us to be able to work within these sort of spaces? And that's where the tokenism comes in, because I feel like it comes from a place of distrust. And that's why I had opened up sort of my speaking today with the word dishonesty, because you're saying, not you, older people, because older people are saying that as younger people, we are trusting you. We want you to carry the baton. We want you to take yourselves to freedom, free from all of these different issues that we, I think, have the right to blame the older generation for. But I don't think the blame only falls on the older generation. I do think that there's that element of wanting to help ourselves, but I also think that there isn't enough support that comes from the older generation, bringing back the question, do you actually trust us? Right. The second is, I actually wanted to ask, how many youth do we know are in power? We can look at the South African government right now. We can look at the Minister of Youth. This might be a task that we might have to go and do. I can almost promise you that that person is not youth. I can almost promise you. And they are the Minister of Youth. They're supposed to be the bridge between youth and like older people, but they represent an older generation. And I think that in itself is a problem. I wanted to talk about how youth make people uncomfortable. I have experienced this. I've spoken directly at the issues that we have, specifically with philanthropic organizations who say, we want to help youth do X, Y, and Z, and then create a program that is supposedly supposed to help youth without actually involving youth in the development of that program, right? I can't really speak about the YCC program today, and I don't know much involvement of youth in that. I do know that I was involved to some extent, but I'm just talking about organizations in general who create these solutions for youth without actually speaking to youth. So you find that when you see youth not getting involved, it's not necessarily because they don't want to, it's because they don't relate. And that in itself is a bridge that now needs to be sort of bridged because it just does not exist. And maybe one way that I would probably suggest is that when you look at the older generation, when you look at the youth, I'm only 22, we would probably need someone who's 35 to be able to bridge that gap. But again, you look at those in power and the structures of governance in this country, and you find that it almost looks like youth do not exist, right? And that's where the anger comes from. That's where the break down the door sort of comes from, because we're not being supported. And I speak on behalf of youth, but I also speak on my own behalf and my own experiences. And I do feel to a certain extent it is intentional because youth, again, make people feel uncomfortable. I start asking questions around why it is that we don't have a proper youth representation in government. That's a problem. Why? Because the youth of 76, dare I say, are the ones who are in power right now. And I always love this question. Michelle, what do you think about the youth of 76? And I don't want to point fingers, but I do think that if they could tap into the spirit that they had in 1976, they would be able to actually connect with us. Because I do feel like we hold the same sort of spirit, particularly about issues that affect us. You look at poverty, you look at climate change as it is, you look at everything else that is coming at youth. I know so many young people who've decided they're not going to continue with school because it's worthless. And that in itself is a problem. But where are we getting the support to actually, be consoled about this climate grief or this doom that's impending? So I guess I maybe want to end it here. And just stress the fact that not all of us are Gretas, but also because I think that I have asked the question whether or not we are trusted, and I feel like we're not trusted, and that's why we can't hold positions in power. We can only do so much. The one thing I cannot do is put myself in government, right? It also means that those in power need to step down. It means they need to make way. It means that right now, it would be less about what the age, because that comes up a lot. Like, well, I mean, you're not young, you're not old enough, and what are your experiences? And I mean, I think this in itself is proof that youth can and have been leading. I am part of a youth-based organization that is leading change, particularly in the social justice space. We are youth-led. That means we are youth and we're leading ourselves. And I think those are just a few things that I wanted to sort of touch on and have us think about. Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. I think those reactions were shared in the room. I heard a couple of clicks, I heard a couple of mm-hms, and online as well. I see the chat box is also blowing up. Sorry that we're not going to read any of that right now, but please continue to engage through the Q&A in the chat box as well. We will get back to a Q&A session at the end. I do want to move over to Bulawa. I know Kulikani did mention something earlier, but I'll move to Bulawa first. Do you want to react to the question around, do you trust us? Do you trust youth? I think there was also some interesting aspects around general statements around what youth repertoires are out there and which ones work, which ones don't, and what strategies we need to take, and maybe what lessons we need to take as well.
Okay. Do I trust young people? I think trust really is evidence through action. Okay, both sides actually. I think the question goes both ways. Do you trust us? As we, so we can talk here, we can talk here about trust until the cows come home, until such that we actually are able to have a course of action that allows both sides to contribute to a common cause, where we both value what we bring into the conversation or into the course of action. That's only when then that we can actually answer that question. Because I can tell you now that I trust you. How do you believe me? You know, I can go back to my office and do exactly the opposite. That's why I'm saying it's evidence through action. Okay, which brings me to the question of systems. Systems, yes, sometimes are archaic and are restrictive, and it's not very easy, for example, to give resources without some kind of risk management system that says we want to make sure that these resources actually go to where they need to go. And that's where you actually then start hitting that brick wall. Because you're young, it's almost like a job seeker who's looking for a job, and they said, what is your experience? And the question is, how am I going to get the experience if you don't give me an opportunity to get experience? And so it becomes a kind of like a secular thing. The question is, how can we match innovation, creativity with experience so that we can build that bridge between young people and older people who are more experienced and have an innovative, creative set of actions that actually give us the outcomes that we're looking for. I mean, I come from a conflict resolution background, and I think maybe, Crispin, your question around rapporteurs hit a note with me, because one of the things around conflict resolution is that you sit at the table and find the solution. You never do anything that's going to make the person that you are trying to influence walk away from the table. The most important thing around conflict resolution is that we sit at that table until we find the solution, and we co-create that solution together, and we trust that we are both sides negotiating in good faith. And anything else doesn't really work. You can't ban the library because there's no books. Because when you get the books, where are you going to get books? We can't ban the bus because the route is wrong. Because at the following day, the same bus is needed. So sometimes we get very frustrated as an older South African, or, you know, I suppose age is nothing but a number in my book anyway, but in any case, you get frustrated because you ask yourself, is there no other way of communicating the message and influencing the powers that be in such a way that there is a clear outcome that adds to the little resources that we've already got, rather than burning what we've got down in order for you to get more? For me, that just doesn't make any sense at all. But I also know that we come from a phase where that was the way of communication. That was the way of getting the message across. And so is there a school of leadership that therefore for young activists to learn how to influence? How come South African YouTubers are so popular all over Africa? They are influencers. Why don't you use that for a cause like climate? Because I watch those YouTubers. In my gen, I actually follow a number of them, because I'm fascinated by the fact that young people can actually have a way of making money, narrative that actually makes sense, that keep me engaged. And actually, I actually tend to forget that they're young because I'm listening to the narrative. Why not use those avenues? I'm looking at you, sir. I shouldn't be, because I'm addressing the other people in the room as well. You've got the opportunity to use tools that are freely available to be able to actually get the message across. Then I go back to the issue of language, which is linked to knowledge, which I actually do feel that we also share there some kind of equal accusations on both sides, that we don't make the information easily digestible and easily available, so that when you are able to, right now, if you go to the young people in KwaZulu-Natal and ask them, do you know about climate change? Of course, they're not going to know. But if you say, do you remember seeing that house sink? And you're asking yourself, how in God's earth can this be possible? And why do you think that is? You go to the Eastern Cape and say, you haven't been able to get any fruit or vegetables from your garden because there hasn't been any rain, or there's been too much rain. People can understand. It's the way we present the message. And so for me, communication becomes quite a critical thing. Of course, the world of philanthropy, I mean, when you are dishing out someone else's money, you need to be very, very, very certain that you are dishing it out for in a way that that money is safeguarded, but it's also in a way that money can do good. Which is why I'm always saying everywhere when I talk to young people, if you have passion, there's no better way to be able to make a good living while doing good as working for a philanthropy or working in a civil society organization. Because it's not the corporate world that, which is also very difficult to get into, by the way, that will actually keep that fire burning in your belly. You are able to make a good living whilst doing good, and also being able to be connected right now. I think our EU colleague was talking about how those opportunities that are being created for South African youth to connect throughout the world on issues that are pertinent in terms of climate. I'm going to end with one thing. I mean, I don't understand why I haven't seen young people toiling around the blackouts, the ESCOM blackouts, because how are you going to study if there are no lights? Why is this not an issue that makes you get up from bed, get into the street and say, somebody do something? But as yet, I haven't seen that. Maybe if I have seen it, I haven't seen it done by young people. I haven't seen young people saying, here's the alternative, you know? And I'm kind of yearning for that. I'm mentioning that in particular because I know it's a great equalizer. It frustrates everybody equally. We all want it solved. We're all embarrassed by it in many respects. At the same time, it also makes it difficult for the young person without a job to get a job. Because where are you going to get a job if your employer can't even keep the lights on? So I'm going to just stand there. Sorry, maybe I'm being too controversial. But my blood is not blue, sorry. So I don't mind.
Yeah, and I definitely think our audience here and online is not shy of controversy. So thank you so much for bringing those perspectives. And I really appreciate your point around communication. I think living in this day and age, living with the tools and the opportunities that we do have, I think that's very important. And in creating access, as you mentioned, in conveying the right messages that will be heard in a way that is relatable, but also in a way in which we can take control of that power that we don't know that we have, or maybe we need to take a bit more control of it. And it actually links back to what Crispy and you mentioned around knowing what processes to work with, knowing what systems to work with, and almost having a strategy. So I do hear, and I'm also absorbing some of the experience and knowledge that you both have and you both bringing to the table, in that we have a lot to learn in how are we going to strategize? How are we going to use our energy and direct our energy in the right way and at the right moments in those key processes that will make impact? And so I'm really interested to hear more about that, how we can make that connection, how we can learn from you and take these types of pieces of advice and actually make it happen and build, and I like your word, co-create together, because it's a way in which we can move forward. So before we move on to the next steps in terms of what actions we should take, I really do want to bring on Khulekani once more in terms of your insights in what has been said, what has been raised, some of the controversial topics that's been raised by all three speakers. Khulekani, would you like to add anything?
Yes, thank you very much. I will start by responding to Crispian, who has provoked us, and say to him, thanks for provoking us. I think this is the attitude of most policymakers. I also should say, I apologize if I sound controversial and also provocative, but I think many policymakers would expect not only youth, but activists to behave in their ways, right? This is what Crispian has done to us. So Crispian is telling us that when we are doing our activism, when we are doing our engagement, our interventions in the climate policies, we should have different repertoires, right? So this is what we should do. We should figure out what should we do when we have broken the door. So this is what Crispin has done to us. So right now we have to go out of this dialogue and do exactly that. So now we have a task. In other words, we have a job from a policymaker, right? And so what I said before was that it should happen the opposite way. We as activists or as young people, we are not expecting any field of study. We are not I mean, we don't work with those systems. Ours is to bring the messages that we want to bring to you. Ours is to do the list of demands to you, and the way in which we will make those demands, it depends on us, and it is your job to actually figure out how do you feature them in, right? So we don't have to. Maybe I can tell you how we do our interventions, especially if you see young people, in the street or protesting. We don't just go in the street and maybe protest, or we don't just seek for spaces without knowing which content should we prepare to present in a space if we get it. If we are preparing for an action, for instance, there will be someone who is prepared to tackle the media if we're doing something, and then the media wants to interview us. Not anyone among us will go to the media. We are prepared for someone to talk to the media, and then among us there will be someone who deals with the content, or a group of people that deal with the content. And those group of people who deal with the content, those are the people that we are pushing. So we do our intervention, we break the door. When we have broken the door, if that is successful, then not all of us get inside. It's people like Michelle that get inside, that knows the content exactly, that would know how to represent us. And so we have our own system. So ours is to do what needs to be done. And from your side as policymakers is to do what we expect you to do. It is actually to do your job and not to create frameworks for us so that we can engage you. And then the second thing, which is I think is the last thing, is that I think in this whole process of the intergenerational dialogue or intergenerational processes, I think we have not really defined what I would suggest that the practical methodologies of our intergenerational equity. Because obviously, if you talk about intergenerational equity, we're not only talking about young people. We're talking about children, the youth, and the adult. But we also are talking about the unborn generation, which I think is one of the reasons why we're here today in June 15. Tomorrow we'll be commemorating a youth day, and we know that there are people that created this community that we live in today back in 1976, and they created this future not only for themselves and not only for the children that were there, but they also created this future for the unborn generation. And so if we are talking about all of this, it's not only the responsibility of the youth to actually talk about intergenerational justice or equity, but it's everybody's responsibility to actually define it in a practical way that will favor not only the people that are living here, but the unborn generation. And I think I have, I think that's what I can say for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kulekani. And I think that actually leads us quite nicely into this next phase of this dialogue, which is really going into the what next, what happens now, what do we do with all our cards on the table? And I think maybe we don't have all the cards out on the table, but we have a lot of it. And as they actually, each one of you has apologized for being provocative today at some point. And I thank you for that, because it takes courage, it takes bravery, and it is a part of that element of building trust, right, is to show your cards. What is it? What are your current views? What are your current experiences? And hopefully we are all listening to each other. And so now I do want us to go into this next phase as to what next. So I'm going to open it up to any one of you who would like to start us off. Any takers?
Maybe I can be
Kulikani, if
the
you
first
also
one
want to just
for
open
the
your
first
mic.
time.
I'm
Yes.
happy. Okay, Kulikani.
Go ahead, Kulikani.
Thank you. I just want to suggest one word, which is consistency. So as young people, everybody knows that we have so many ideas, and we are not hesitant to put our ideas into practice. And as I'm the late youth. I'm about to exit that youth stage. But I know that when I joined activism, there were different movements within climate justice activism. And as I grew up in the climate justice activism, there has been some kind of like new movements which are not different from what has been happening before. And I will make just this one example about what we know internationally. And Crispian has referred to Greta Thunberg. There has been an international youth movement which was eventually formalized under UNFCCC, the Yango. But then back in 2017 or 2018, then there was this youth movement of Fridays for Future. Then it kind of like, taken over this youth movement internationally. So with those different movements, I don't want anybody to be confused that we are confused. I don't want anybody, especially the policymakers, to think that we are changing our minds. No, we're not changing our minds. It's the same thing that we are calling for. It's climate justice. It's intergenerational justice. We want it to be a matter of emergency. We want a climate emergency, and that all refers to the consistency. We are consistent, although we may create different movements with different models, but our demands are still the same. We are still demanding the same thing. So it's not different things. And I'm sure that in the near future, maybe in 2 years or 3 years from now, there may be another new movement within the climate activism space. But then that would not mean that we have changed our minds. So what I'm suggesting here is that what needs to be on the discourse is the consistency, because this is how we are doing our consistency. And even from policymakers, there should not be any confusion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kulikani, for starting us off.
I'll go
I see
next.
Bulawa wants to go next. Go ahead.
Okay, I think what comes next, or maybe if I can just say what would be the next course of action from my side, it's just a bit more pragmatism on both sides. Kuliani talks about movements. Movements are the most difficult things to fund from a philanthropic point of view. Because who do you get to give the money to? And how do you in fact audit it? At the same time, we know that movements are necessary, and usually they are value adds when it comes to being able to have an impact, especially when it comes to civil society issues, especially the issue that we're talking about now, which is climate. So the question is, how do you support a movement? How do you set up a movement in a pragmatic way that takes into consideration the fact that you are going to require resources as a movement in order to have the oxygen to survive, and being able to bring to the table that solution, so that we don't look at who's going to host this movement, and then suddenly we have this forced marriage between the movement and the finance host, and then we find ourselves becoming mediators between the two. It's just something that we've learned a lot through it, and we don't want to repeat it. I'm now talking as a philanthropy, from the philanthropy side. The second thing is to have those voices that are able to bring the message across, as I say, but make those voices well surface those voices is the best way I can put it, so that they don't only get into the room with 10 people, but they're actually known. How do you know Greta? It's because Greta is known. The media has made sure that she is known. She was looking very overwhelmed in Glasgow, and I could understand why, the poor child. I mean, honestly, she became the face of everything. We need that. We need more of that. Not just one. We need a lot of those kind of faces, so that I don't have to think and say, oh, I saw somebody in that room with like 150 people. I need to hear those voices. There are many other ways of actually surfacing those voices. Most of those things are actually free. Go to Mhlebo Wenene top down. There is, if you look at the stats of that top down show, which is listened by people all over the world, including South Africans in the diaspora, why don't you use that platform? They are always looking for content. The other thing, what I would say is that I am hoping that our divergent views cannot take away the fact that we have a common interest, and that common interest really outweighs our vested interest. So we should be able, if we are able to better democracy through sufficient consensus, surely we can deal with our issues around climate change as South Africans through that kind of model as well. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks. And I really enjoy the way in which these actions are made as challenges to us here in the room, to the panelists, but also to you online and beyond this room as well. So thank you for that, in framing it as a challenge and as things that I can see myself contributing to as well. So before I move on, I just want to remind everyone we will have a Q&A after this. So please do think about your questions around the topics we discussed in the panel today, and pop it in the Q&A box. If you are online, in person, we'll be taking a few as well. So please have your questions ready. Michelle, you wanted to add as well. Go ahead.
I did. I think it's becoming habit. I've got another question to pose to the older generation. And I think maybe to Crispin and Bulelwa specifically, my question is, how are you supporting youth? Perhaps in your personal capacity? Because again, I think, as you've mentioned, I think we can go like in circles talking about you don't trust us and we don't trust you and but how are you making sure that we can actually trust you? Because what's happened is over the last few years, we looked to you for help and support and comfort. And we've had to take to the streets and take power into our own hands so that we can save ourselves. And I think that is actually quite problematic, because I don't think any child deserves to experience a world where they're having to save their future. So then the question is, how are you supporting young people? Maybe even what are your efforts into building that trust? Because I think, again, like this is such a big step for me, even to sit here and actually take criticism and actually realize that to some extent it is right. But how are you then going to create those spaces, even beyond today, for us to then be able to collaborate, and maybe not even with me specifically, but with other members of youth, maybe from your communities, and maybe specifically on the Presidential Climate Commission? How are we going to get more youth on there? That was the first thing. The second was that I wanted to speak a little bit about how, Bulelwa, you had mentioned that we haven't quite seen youth talk about the energy future, and we have. One very tangible action that's currently happening is the youth of South Africa, supported by the African Climate Alliance, are taking the government to court to make sure that the government, and they have now said that they will actually oppose us in court, to make sure that our energy future is protected. Why? Because we're obviously seeing that depending on coal is not sustainable. That is why we're having the blackout, right? How are we then going to move into an energy future that actually puts our future as a priority? How are we going to start moving to renewable energy? But also, how are we then going to start having this conversation around the just transition, which will have me go to like my second point, which is around education, and that as an action. What is the just transition, right? And how can we start talking about it? Specifically when you bring it back to like the just energy transition. And that is something that we are currently trying to address, because we actually have policy representatives. We have youth who do have diplomatic behavior and can engage on a diplomatic level with the older generation. So that's just one thing that I wanted to note, that we've taken to the streets. We are taking to the streets again tomorrow as youth, and we're going to be addressing all of these problems, because we realize that climate change or the climate crisis is an intersectional issue, and we cannot just say, well, the environment is going to degrade. We need to note that one of the reasons why South Africa is not yet resilient is the fact that it's a poverty-stricken country, right? It is a country that serves two South Africas, and that is quite often the white and rich, and then the rest of the people, right? That is another thing. So when we look at the climate crisis through an intersectional lens, we start to realize that when youth say put our futures as a priority, we're actually talking about the energy future. We're talking about the educational future. We're talking about food insecurity. We're talking about all these different things, access to water, right? That is another thing. And I just really felt like I would be underserving youth if I did not address those two things. Then maybe moving on to like practical ways forward. My passion lies in education, because I believe that in itself means that you're going to start having youth that can engage with such methods. It means it's not education in the most traditional way. I'm in university. I don't quite like it because it's just very archaic in the way that it is. I more look at facilitation and collaborative ways of learning. That means I think this in itself has been an educational experience. So when you look at what to do next, you look at maybe I'll speak from an African Climate Alliance perspective in the ways that we are taking action, is that we've currently got 3 programs. The one is education, or rather a lot of our work stems from like an educational core, because we believe that the youth of South Africa are not aware of the issues. When we start using all of these different terms, just transition, climate crisis, environmental degradation, what does 1.5 degrees Celsius mean to any ordinary South African, right? So when you address those things and you really start talking about them, you allow people to start moving into a space where they can take action. That means starting to engage on with policy. That means starting to engage with other members of their community, right? Because if we're really looking at it from a very realistic perspective, I do not have the capacity to go around each and every community in South Africa talking about climate change. I don't have the resources. I, as a person, will become emotionally depleted, and I will not be useful for the movement. So I cannot do that. But we can do that through empowering people through education, right? Last is advocacy. That goes back to what I had addressed earlier about how we actually have youth in the movement who are a little bit more diplomatic, who can engage on all these different levels, because such is the nature of the movement. And another thing is that we actually need to stop gatekeeping change making, is how I feel. I don't think that change making, specifically in a South African context, looks any one way. I think if I can throw a glass to the road, I should be able to do that. I also think if I prefer to be more on the academic side, I should also be allowed to do that. So that means that we're going to allow for there to be room for the diversity that we heard earlier from Crispian to actually exist within the space. That means actually realizing that there's so many different offerings that come with youth. Again, I speak mainly from a youth perspective, and what I've experienced specifically with youth actually wanting to get involved, but not necessarily having the resources that allow them to. Why? Because youth might seem as though they don't want to involve themselves because they don't have the proper necessary education to understand it. There's nothing worse than feeling inadequate on a panel because I'm unable to engage with the older generation, right? That again is addressing specifically the change-making aspect. If you're sitting on a panel as a young person with academics, it becomes very, very difficult to engage, because all of these words are being thrown around. It becomes almost like an academic exercise, specifically for older people who are most often in academia, who a lot of the times are also these practitioners. It's your lucky day, Crispian. Like Crispian, being a PhD, being a PhD candidate, but also being a practitioner within the environmental space. I think I speak on your behalf to say a lot of the times it becomes even difficult to speak to the regular person because of how high level the conversations become, right? Even on an international level. And just moving from that, I think one thing that we need to understand is that whatever activism we have on the ground in South Africa and in Africa should not be looked at as palatable, or should not at all be palatable, because we are just so different, and we cannot fit this box of what activism should look like. And unfortunately, I am not for everybody. Like, that's just the nature of life, right? That is the nature of people. And activism should be allowed to live within youth in a way that is most comfortable to those people, because then that means they're most able to shine. And I then want to actually ask from the older generation for guidance. I think that that is one action that we can actually take moving on from here. What can we do to better engage with the older generation? What can we do to better set ourselves up to be able to be meaningful change makers? How can I, as a young person wanting to get into philanthropy, actually do it in such a way that older people actually trust me, right? That is something that kind of is missing, because young people are loud, because young people might not necessarily be trustworthy, because experience is an issue. How can we be under your wings so that we are actually able to grow into these people who can really just engage within the space? And I think specifically around, I really liked how you spoke about, Bulelo, specifically about how young people are like influencers and everything. And we quite often hear about the example of Greta Thunberg, but we quite often forget that Greta Thunberg is from the West. And a lot of the times how I actually got into the space was I could not see a Black person, a Black young person was speaking about these issues. And so I became that person. A lot of the times Black people, and this is a fact, are not put on the international stage so that they can actually engage in meaningful ways. We saw with Vanessa Nakate when she was, I forgot where she was, but the Western media actually cut her out. And maybe then this becomes a more direct request, specifically to the EU delegate, to say how then can we start imagining these different partnerships that actually feed into making sure that African youth specifically get an equal stake to be addressing these issues, because we are very knowledgeable. We might not necessarily speak English in a very palatable way, but we can engage on these issues. And I think those are obviously some of my asks, but also some really key takeaway points that I kind of got. But also just, I think as a closing, to really talk about how important intergenerational collaboration is. And I think that has sort of shined through me asking for guidance, right? Because we do realize as young people that we can't do this by ourselves. But we also realize that a lot of the times it's very difficult because there's so much resistance coming from older people. So how then do we all sort of move forward in a way that is really sort of meaningful?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Michelle. I think I definitely related to a lot of the questions that you posed, and I also want the answers. I think that you brought a lot of interesting, pragmatic ways in which we can move forward, and specifically challenging those partners that we work with and challenging those, even ourselves. So I really am inspired by you and what you shared with us today. And lastly, we are going to Crispian for your perspectives on what we need next. You can add to what was already said, and you can also provide your own perspectives as well. So really interested to hearing from you.
Okay, no, good. And thanks for all the inputs and suggestions. I mean, so let me just say, the Climate Commission is committed to make sure that young people participate meaningfully in all of our deliberations, and we're willing to give you whatever platform you need to lift that voice up to the highest decision makers. That's a commitment I'm making. And as part of that commitment, I mean, I've heard some very important things. The one is that we need to put climate issues in a way that people can relate to. Yeah. And often that involves not talking about climate change, but really talking about skills and jobs and opportunities that lie in the future green economy. So I completely get that, and I completely get the issue around making sure that the way our processes, our consultation and decision-making processes are designed accommodate young people. Not to do it, for instance, when you are studying. We can't pull you out of school or university or technikon. And young people need to be empowered to engage in those processes. So all of that I hear. I want to just add, because I'm still on my provocative mode, two other things that I think on young people's side, I would recommend you think about. So the one was on process. I wanted to illustrate the point about process with just a quick example about the budget. One of the big issues young people argue about is that we've got a budget that's highly skewed to the already empowered, and it doesn't adequately fund education, skills, employment incentives, and empowering young people. It's a skewed, biased budget. So the question is, what do you do about that? Now, when the budget is tabled, most people focus on when the budget's tabled in Parliament and mounting protests, and there've been some really dramatic people's protests at the gates of Parliament when the budget gets tabled. And I think that's important. I mean, the one thing I don't want anyone to mistake, I'm not saying don't protest. I believe in protest. I've used it successfully in my past as a youngster, and I think it's an important part of the repertoire. All I'm suggesting is that you diversify your repertoire. So you've got tools, you've got the protest tool, you've got the engagement with decision makers tool. So like the engagement with decision makers tool is a slightly different toolbox. Because if you want the real decision makers at the table, like the CEOs of corporates, the real people that make decisions in government, you need to think about what's going to bring them to the table, because if they're not at the table, you can shout as much as you want, you're gonna have no influence at all. So there's a mode of getting decision makers to the table. And I know you're gonna say, well, I'm now asking you to compromise your principles and sit down and talk to these capitalist criminals that are exploiting the poor. I'm just saying there's a time when you've got to get the decision makers to the table. There's a time that you have to talk policy. And I know that policy can be alienating for a lot of people. And when you talk to old fossils like me, we've got all the policy lingo, and I've seen fees must fall students in detailed negotiations around the funding of higher education in a very informed way. And I don't think, they just insisted, this is what we want. We want higher education funded. It's got to be free. You can't exclude poor people from a decent university education. And by persistently sitting at the table and demanding decision makers come and discuss this issue, they eventually got what they wanted. So I don't completely buy the thing that you can't talk policy, and policy is too alienating. You must demand to talk policy, and who cares that you don't use the right language and don't couch it diplomatically, you know, but you do need to get into the detail and grapple with it. Otherwise, you're not going to be in the debate. You know, the debate's going to happen at another level that you're not involved in. So all I'm saying is have a toolbox. Bang the door down when it needs to be broken down. Talk when you need to talk. Engage in policy and substance when you need to. And have a proper theory of change. And I don't think a theory of change can only be built on protest. I think a theory of change needs you to have everything at, you know, this is going back to basic, you know, left-wing organizational theory. You've got to work out what your objective is, how you want to get there, when you're going to use protest, when you're going to do other things as part of that. You know, the older generation is never going to like you forcing your way in. You know, you've got to force your way in. What I'm giving you an undertaking from the commission, and the commission's not just made up of old fossils like me. I mean, I even employ the majority of my staff are young people because, you know, I think that's where the future lies, and they're the people that need to be leading the change. But, you know, we guarantee you to try and work with organizations across the political spectrum, across the different social classes, and right across the country. We want you in this change. And the climate transition is a revolution. We're talking about deep systemic transformational change right across society, where we need to reconfigure power relations, economic relations, the way that we do business in this country. It's a profound revolution. The energy for that revolution ain't going to come from my generation. We're tired. You know, we think we know all the answers. We don't. The energy for the revolution is going to come from you. So I recognize the power that you bring to the table. And we've got to find a way of just unlocking it and getting it into this transformational exercise that we need. Sorry, that turned into a rant. I didn't mean to.
Thank you so much, Crispian. And that really does help us kind of close off our panel discussion that's held between the four of us, or the five of us, including Kulekani. I think I am hearing common threads from all of you. I think I also would like to emphasize the angle that you brought now in terms of understanding the processes that we need to influence and actually finding out. I think this is something that I've learned in my experience in the plastics policy space, is that sometimes you do need to sit back and observe, okay, where are these processes happening? Where do we need the youth voices, and what sort of tools we are going to take from our toolbox, because not everything will work in every instance. And as Michelle also mentioned, is that we shouldn't gatekeep what change making looks like. We have diverse voices and we just need to take ownership of that. So I'm really excited about some of these challenges that all of the panelists kind of pose to all of us. And I really want our audience here today to, and including myself, is to really think about what is your personal contribution to that. What challenge will you be taking on when you leave today? And I do want to just check in how much time we have for the Q&A session, because I think we have like lots of interesting questions coming up. We have 10 minutes. Okay, so we're going to try to use that wisely between our online participants and in person. I'm going to start with online. And some of these questions are not addressed specifically to one person. So I do also want you to indicate who's keen to answer it first. Please do. But I can also pose it to one of you. The first one from Millie is, why do the youth have to take to the streets to address these issues? Is there a lack of platforms being provided from the older generation that is in power? And if so, how can we address this? Any takers? So Michelle is...
Okay, I'll jump in.
Yeah, Bulama, go ahead.
I think you need to take to the streets because the streets is where it's happening to begin with. You can't do this behind the door. You need to be out there and be seen. And in order for us to recognize that there is an issue that needs to be dealt with, I go back to Christian's point that there is a room for protests. I mean, tomorrow, if everybody celebrates Youth Day behind the door, we're not going to see it. We want you out there being able to celebrate being young. In South Africa, you were young until you are 35, which is actually quite, you're actually middle-aged, my friend. I'm sorry to say. At the age of 35, you really should have been making decisions that are really directing your life, but I'm not going to go there. But so I'm just saying that, yes, you have young adults that actually have mature voices, and those voices sometimes are heard better if they are on the streets. There are other platforms. So the streets are not the only platform that's available. There are other platforms that can be used. And also, I need to also say that South Africa also needs to reach beyond the South African borders. So you want to be able to link with other African youth for issues that are actually kind of cross-cutting issues such as climate change. Because if you look at Rwanda, I mean, I heard the other day a very young woman from Rwanda addressing a panel, and I was so impressed with the knowledge, the articulation of issues that are facing her, and the solutions that are coming, that she was coming up with, where everybody else was literally hanging on, on what she was saying. So there's many ways of making sure that your movement is not just in one part of the continent, but it's actually a continental-wide movement, in which case you are able to then have cross-pollination of ideas. And as I keep going back to co-creating the solutions that we want to see.
Yes, you may. So we have someone from the floor. We're just going to hand a mic over to you.
Rihad Desai, my day job's documentary filmmaking, and I've been a climate justice activist for just over a decade. I think it's very interesting what's happening, specifically when you look at the IPCC's last reports, which talk about equity, talk about putting social justice at the centre, and the sort of system change that climate justice activists and Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future have taken up. And I think Crispin's absolutely right. In that sense, it is a revolution because there's very entrenched interests. And until we can build a movement on, using the tremendous injection and power of the youth that began to emerge before the pandemic here on the continent, talking about breaking the door open or kicking the door open isn't going to happen in any meaningful level. What you will see as the movement begins to emerge is the attempt to co-opt the energy of that movement, the anger, because anyone who's read about what's coming down the road or has been reading knows what you're facing when you're my age. That's where the anger is. That's why the militancy's there. And that's what's going to drive the agenda. Because, we went to speak to Barbara Creasy, we thought this is a great woman, great, reputation and so on. What are you going to do, Barbara? Essentially, she said, when you can come with a movement and make real demands on us, then we can talk about what I can do. Until then, I'm trapped. This country's built around fossil fuels. and they're still trying to dig up more gold, oil and gas. And that's where the connection, that's where the dialogue's got to be for the climate justice movement. It's about how do we build a movement of movements? How do you connect with those coastal communities that are fighting against the exploration of gas and oil? How do you take your fight against coal into oil and gas? And I think this is, I'd be very wary of getting sucked in to these processes which attempt to ingratiate you and make you feel important because you're a youth, that, we must have that sector there. I think we need to forget that, because really the reason why, it's not only because we're tired, we don't have the interest that you'd have. By the time it's really bad, we're dead. Yeah? You and your children are going to face the horrors. And we can see, we only have to look a few weeks back at what happened in KZN when a few hundred people died. There's going to be thousands of people dying in these events as we go down the road. So that would be my take on the matter is, we've got to, the movement building is the critical questions, and we know what those solutions are. We don't need to get into the policy space. We've known what those solutions are for quite a while from the climate justice movement. And now the UN itself is taking up those solutions as the solutions.
Thank you so much for that contribution. And again, another voice from the older generation, also highlighting the urgency and the importance of the diversity of interventions that we need to take. So I do want to get in a few more questions. So I want to know, is there anyone in the room live with us here that has a question? We have one over there. And if you'd like to direct it to a particular panelist, please let us know.
So to anyone who wants to take it, I suppose, but maybe to the EU representative. I'm just interested, South Africa is obviously the largest carbon emitter in Africa, so making significant changes here to the way that we treat the climate is huge for Africa in general, but can we just speak, we brought it up earlier and you just brought it up now, can we speak to how improving climate action, climate activism, and climate conversations in South Africa can and will extend across Africa, if and when? Sorry, Adam Buch, and I'm in public health and development.
We have one more question in the room. Go ahead.
Precious from Fridays for Future. So one of the things I noticed that wasn't spoken a lot about was desperation that leads to tokenism. I think there are a lot of young people that are so desperate that, and I used to be one of them, that even though I knew I was being used, I didn't care, because for me it was, I'm so desperate, I need something to happen now, and I need to bring light to the situation now, that even if I am being used, it doesn't really matter. So my question for the panelists is, how do we educate and enable young people to take action that is based on ways that, is used that from our passion for our climate rather than our desperation to be safe?
Okay, so those are the two questions. Michelle, you want to answer one of them?
Yeah. I want to try. I think maybe before we arrive at the actual question, I think it's very important, again, to get back to the fact that the climate crisis is intersectional. And I think one of the conversations that must be had when we start talking about justice is the willingness, particularly when you look at South Africa as the case in point, the willingness for those who have historically held power and wealth to be able to shift that power and wealth. That's something that we're currently not seeing. So now we're back to the controversy, but we aren't saying it. When you look at apartheid as, or its legacy that it's left so many Black and brown people in such destitute, in like sort of environment, so much so that they're unable to participate, they're unable to afford education, they're unable to afford healthcare and other such things. So when we start talking, I think for me specifically, when I speak climate change and the climate crisis, I'm specifically talking to the social justice issues that are affecting people who look like me, people who sound like me. And I think it would be so unfair for us to talk about the climate crisis in a way that is, I don't want to use this word, but I don't have any other, that is sort of diplomatic, because it's not really addressing the issues that sort of are present. So I did mention this was becoming a habit, but how are historically privileged people, and I think maybe to be a lot more direct, how are white people willing to shift the power and wealth to be able to actually turn things around in South Africa? Because look, when we talk about adaptation, when we talk about action, when we talk about advocacy, it's very, very evident that fine, the opportunities might be there, but the access isn't. And that is one thing that is obviously barricading us being able to, bring about change. Because a lot of the times we're having all of these high level sort of conversations, this being one of them. Let's really come back to the context of South Africa. How many other young Black and brown people are able to actually tune in and be a part of these conversations? How many people are actually willing to shift wealth? When we speak about justice, we should be able to actually go, hang on, this is a very, very sort of silly example, but I'm going to sell my 5 houses in Kemps Bay and be able to, fund the climate justice movement. I mean, that is huge, that is massive. And I'm still waiting for like historically privileged people to be able to prove that they're actually in it, in the fight for what's coming next. Because right now we hear a lot of what are young people doing? Young people are taking to the streets. We don't have the wealth. We don't have the kind of power that comes with access to resources. We don't have the kind of power that comes with white privilege. We don't have the power that comes with having, the media in your pocket. So how are, I think that maybe becomes a part of the question. How are people who have been historically privileged actually willing to actually put the money where their mouth is? How are we willing in South Africa to shift the money and the wealth to sort of move into a space that actually has everybody's best interest at heart? Because I can promise you now, the moment I start talking about people's pockets, it becomes, hang on, but it's not that bad. I'm going to be dead anyway by the time the climate crisis takes us. So then to very quickly just address the issue of desperation, I think that is a very real thing. But I don't think that as youth, you should be, I think it's valid to be very desperate for change. But I think at some point you need to be able to pick up your worth and wear your confidence. Look, the opportunities are going to come. And I speak to any other young person who's in the audience. Don't be afraid to speak your truth. Don't be afraid to say no to opportunities, because it's not all of them that will get you to where you're trying to be. The right people will hear you. The desperation, I mean, it is there. It's there everywhere. I am very desperate for change currently. I'm desperate for social justice to actually become true within my lifetime, which it's seeming like it isn't, right? People should not be living in sort of tin houses and zinc structures. That is not right, right? So the desperation, I mean, it's very valid to be feeling that way. But at the same time, I think when you realize your worth and when you realize the power that your voice has, you will find that you start engaging with people who will start looking and listening to you. You also find that you make a lot of people uncomfortable. I can almost promise you right now that by talking about apartheid and the accumulation of wealth, I've made a lot of people uncomfortable, but that's not going to stop me from talking about it. And I think those are some of the things that we actually need to start talking about when we talk about action, when we talk about change, when we talk about when climate change is going to come, and if and when we talk about the redistribution of wealth, when we talk about, funds like from the West and other such things, we're needing to realize that it's high time that we start talking about like climate reparations and other such things, because then that's where true justice sort of lies.
Thank you so much for that, Michelle. And unfortunately, we don't have too much time for the rest of the questions. I do know that those in the room will have time to mingle a little bit later with our panelists. And those online, you will be able to contact and communicate with us through our various channels as well to keep this conversation going. And I would like to leave us all with this reflection on how exactly what you are going to challenge yourself with in your personal capacity, given what you currently have, given the resources, the platforms, the spaces, the spheres of influence that you currently have, what is it that you're going to take away today? And I challenge all our panelists, but also everyone as part of our audience. I do see that we have Ariana to provide a few words before we go on to our final speaker for the day.
From the EU side, I just want to end with the message of hope. I think the fact that as a bloc of 500 million citizens, we have chosen, and our head of states have chosen to go on to a model of growth that is green, that is more inclusive, that is a partnership with the sister continent that is Africa. It's a sign that when a citizen demands a certain transformation of society, it can happen. It takes time, but it happens. So I just want to offer that reflection.
Can I say that?
It's important to hope. It's important to line up your forces behind your hope. And that's what I did when I was a climate negotiator. That's what everyone does in climate negotiation. You don't give up. It's 4 a.m. in the night. You haven't slept in 40 hours. You stay in the room. You fight. You get your point, and sometimes it's a comma, sometimes it's a word, but you get there. You don't give up. It's a long fight. We are in there for 2050. We are in there for 2100. That's what we are here for. And then you pass on the mic to the next person after you, but you don't give up.
I'll add one thing, so we're going to allow it to do so.
I'm going to challenge the youth. Okay, we've got COP27 fast approaching, and what I want to say, bring to the Open Society Foundation a strong South African youth movement around just energy transition that will be with us in Egypt, so that you can be able to experience that space, be able to have your voices heard. I'll do my best to get you there. So I just want to say that, because there's this feeling that, there's no door to knock. Here is a platform. If you actually put actions behind your convictions, don't bring me a group of amorphous people that I don't know where the head or the tail is. I just want a clear agenda, a clear force of action, and a clear, group of people that says, this is what we want to do. And we will be able to support you. And fortunately, I also want to say this launch is, in fact, again, another platform and access. Use it. It's available.
It's only fair, Crispian, for you to add your final word. Please go ahead.
I think everything has been said, and I completely agree with the points that have been made. The question for me, so I need no persuasion that you've got this intersection between historical inequality and skewed ownership and structural poverty and the climate crisis. And the two are intersecting and aggravating inequality. So they're making the triple challenge we face as a country far worse. And the statistics are just terrible. All of our indicators are going south. The issue for me is, when can we, do we solve all of these things together, or do we solve them at times slightly separately? And I've had this argument put to me, and I don't buy it, that you can't do anything on climate until you've solved all these other development questions. So I agree they are integrally related and they're part of the same political economy. and we need deep structural transformation to change. But I equally don't think that we can't do anything without that. So, you know, I think the important thing is to get agency and to get moving. The climate thing is a problem because, you know, you've as Rahad said earlier, you've got these economic interests attached to the old order who have all the power and the influence, and we're trying to get to a new world order where the economic interests are not yet born. They're emerging technologies. They're young black entrepreneurs that aren't yet in the system. They don't have power and influence. So how do you get the political economy lined so that you transition to the new economy and get these new economic forces unlocked? And to me, that's not an easy question. There's no silver bullet around it. And I think, you know, our earlier points, you know, this repertoire of things that we need to be engaging in to drive that new future are pertinent.
Thank you to all our panelists. And I'm now going to hand over to Thando Lukoku, and he will be closing us off today with an exciting opportunity in the Youth Climate Champions space. So over to you, Thando. I think you are joining us online.
Yes, I am. Could you guys just confirm if you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Just to take an opportunity to say thank you to the EU for supporting the work of CAAP and supporting this program. Thank you to the speakers for their time. Thank you for you guys for listening, both virtually and in person. And then thank you also to the organizing team for making such a wonderful session happen. I think it definitely was quite a lot to enjoy about it, and looking forward to having additional ones. Some quick announcements on my side. So the first one is just for everyone who's in the studio, just to note that there's going to be music and food and drinks served on the rooftop. After difficult and very thought-provoking conversations, you can just wash it down with some lovely eats and drinks. And then the last thing is then a boot camp. Specifically, as part of the YCC initiative, we are hosting a spring school climate boot camp. It will consist of, excuse me, it will consist of an intensive 2-week knowledge and capacity building curriculum. In the first week, we'll hold it virtually and then make it available to all to participate in. In the second week, though, we'll then look to having an in-person event of around 25 people. Please note that there will be applications for the in-person bootcamp. The focus of that specific bootcamp will be around engaging and capacitating young people specifically who are in the early stages of their journey with climate activism. So we look both forward to individuals and working together with groups and engaging on some of these lovely issues and together with some of the local activists. So please, if you're interested, do either get in touch with the colleagues there at the venue or drop a mail to some of the email addresses that you would have received communication on. Just to also note that the event will be for around 25 people, somewhere around Johannesburg, but the venue is to be confirmed. And then we will also provide additional information around accommodation, meals, and transport to the venue. And then just to kind of plan your diaries, it will happen somewhere between the 3rd and the 7th of October later on this year. So please do ensure that you do submit. If you don't have any email addresses, ask the colleagues on the ground as well, if they could just share the email addresses with you. And then that's all from us, guys. Thank you so much for your time. And I appreciate, or rather we appreciate all of your time for sticking with us to the end. Thank you so much, and over back to you guys.
Thanks, Thando, and thank you so much for everyone who joined virtually.